What does that do for the US-China strategic competition? Because that is such an overarching thing for the global economy. If things get really bad between these two, even more of a heightened trade war than we saw in term one of Trump, what does that do to the market?
China has its own way to fight back. Recently, banning of certain rare earths and minerals that the world needs, not only for transition to green energy, but also for military. They control 80 to 90% of most of this stuff.
You're a big supporter of more, shall we say, traditional forms, gold, but Bitcoin has now surpassed 100,000. What does that tell you about the state of people's preferences?
Every central bank outside of the G7 has been buying gold for the last 15 years, and now at an accelerating pace. Whereas on the other hand, you have the American media screaming at the top of their lungs for the retail community to buy Bitcoin. Sell your gold and buy Bitcoin as a Bitcoin reserve. If you've got the time, I can walk you through why this is a really dumb idea that will never work practically.
This is The Global Gambit.
How you going? So, listen to a story, everyone. About a year and a half ago, I was sitting in Mexico under a thatched roof, and I was having a conversation with someone, and I was very excited because I just surpassed 400 subscribers, and this guest was very kind enough to join me at the infancy of the channel, and as we pass 40,000 now, so thank you very much to all of those of you who've joined since. I'm rejoined by him. It is Frank Justra, who is the CEO of Fiora Group and philanthropist, and someone who was kind enough to talk about very many different things early 2023. And now we're at the end of 2024. Things are not looking, I think, any rosier. Frank, I don't know if you'd agree with that, but it's lovely to see you. How are you doing? Not bad. Just trying to make it through, I think, the rest of the year, as many of us are. But the first question I really wanted to ask you in this whirlwind of things we're going to talk about is, we're going to talk mainly, I think, the macro geopolitical relationship, interestingly. And I think whether or not you would agree with this sentiment, but so many global conflicts and just issues are going to be heavily changed or influenced by Trump. So very simply, I was quite interested to know how you feel about that. We've even got him joking about turning Canada and Mexico into states, and Governor Trudeau. So when you look at that from your perspective, do you have cautious optimism or hope, or realistic, pessimism about what he might do?
Especially with the threat of punishing those countries that want to participate in de-dollarization, which has been an ongoing trend now. I've been speaking about it for a number of years. At first it was being poo-pooed by, all the American media and the policymakers as it will be impossible. You can't do it. There's no alternative. Where are they going to go? Well, it's happening, and it's been happening. I've been writing about this and speaking about this topic for about 5 years now. And now the U.S. under Trump is finally reacting in a way that I thought that they would. They don't like it because the implication of losing reserve status of the U.S. dollar are very serious implications. It would mean a loss of standard of living, higher inflation, higher interest rates, and most importantly, a loss of power. The U.S. would no longer be able to sanction countries around the world in the way that it has, because it uses the U.S. dollar system as a means to punish countries, primary sanctions, secondary sanctions, etc. So I think that Trump's statement that any country that even thinks about de-dollarizing, he will punish with 100% tariffs, was an acknowledgement of how serious the problem is, because it's moving very rapidly. My personal belief is that if he took that approach, it will backfire tremendously. It will only serve to accelerate the de-dollarization movement that is taking place, as countries will want to get rid of their U.S. treasuries as a reserve asset in order to avoid being sanctioned. And they will find alternative ways to trade in non-U.S. dollar methods, which is already happening all over the world. This move towards local currencies, trading in local currencies, the M-Bridge project that China initiated with the BIS. All of these things will just accelerate if he starts to try and punish countries. So I think a lot of it is, and probably the people around Trump are advising him that is a definite possibility. But I think, again, it's about his style. His style is to threaten, to bully, to use the power of the U.S. as a cudgel against the rest of the world, allies included, to get his way. It's all about America first. And it's going to have very serious implications for the rest of the world, for the West and for the non-West and the BRICS. I think we're going through a period of incredible transformation in the world order, and it's going to be very rocky. And there's a real potential of escalation of conflict, as does happen throughout history when you have these kind of shifts in global power. So I'm pessimistic. I think these things usually go through a period of intense conflict of different types. You can have trade wars, currency wars, and then of course you can have hot wars, and they kind of follow a similar pattern throughout history. So it's what's over the horizon is unknown. We're reaching that event horizon in the black hole right now, where you can't tell. There's no way to predict what's on the other side.
But on that point, I mean, I'm sure some people have read or are familiar with Ray Dalio's How to Manage the World Order Changing, right? I know that's not the title, The Changing World Order, right? Why Nations Succeed and Fail. But I feel that this time it is a bit different. We can talk about world cycles and the ebbs and flows of power, as we have done from the Dutch to the British to the Americans. But it seems different in that technology and the rate at which we have advanced, even in the past, post World War II period, right, is unlike anything we've ever seen. And so I do wonder whether or not our ability to just say that it's going to be the same as usual and the United States is going to be replaced by China, I don't know. I feel like we're in for a slightly different trajectory, or you still think we're going to see that?
Once said, history may not repeat, but it rhymes. Of course, it's going to be different, but there are certain things that, and throughout history, every change was different, and it certainly will be different this time. And there's no way to predict that, it's like in the past, it'll go directly from the U.S. to China. I don't believe that either. I think that China is smart enough to understand that it has to have an alliance of countries working with it to compete with the West, and which is done through BRICS and all the institutions that have been created to mirror the Western institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the currency swap arrangements. All of these things are intended to create a parallel system that can compete with the Western system. So it's going to be different, but it is changing, and it will change. And the U.S. is going to have a very difficult time trying to rein in that change. It's the Western balance sheets, government balance sheets, are in a dismal situation. Japan, the U.S., Europe, fiscally, they're in trouble. Okay, they're piled on way too much debt, and it's the East that's growing, not the West. So I think that a change of economic power is happening. It's going to happen slowly, but it's happening. And de-dollarization will increase, and other methods of cross-border payments are going to come into play. They already are, and the U.S. is going to have a tough time trying to compete with it. It will compete, and it has already started to compete. Especially in places like Africa, where China has had a 20-year head start in investment in infrastructure and resource extraction. The U.S. has finally woken up, and now they're trying to compete. With the Libido corridor in Zambia, Angola, and DRC, and China is responding in kind, upgrading their railroad to the Tanzanian coast. So all of this stuff is happening, and it's and not that the BRICS are unified and speak in one voice. They all have their own internal issues with each other. India versus China, etc. But they do welcome, and so does the global South, welcomes an alternative system that is going to be less costly to them, and give them an opportunity to allow for competition.
No, certainly. I think it would be, I summarize it as diversification. A lot more developing countries, the global South, want diversification away from US-led institutions and the order, and the weaponization of the dollar is a more specific subset of that, a factor. But just to this point then, because if Trump were to implement these tariffs, he seems to think that tariffs can be a sort of carrot and a stick for many other countries and the ability to influence their foreign policy and strategical interests. How far can he go before he really begins to undermine that? Or at the present time, he still does have that sort of leverage?
It depends to the extent by which he uses a stick as opposed to a carrot. Now, the Biden administration has been trying the carrot route, and it's something they should have thought about a while ago. But at least they're trying it. Trump will have a different style, but again, I think some of it, if he goes through with some of his threats, some of the more serious threats on tariffs, especially the one of 100% tariffs on countries that de-dollarize, I think that will backfire. I really do, and I think they're going to have to eventually wake up to the fact that they're going to have to use more carrots than sticks, or find a balance. I mean, you could think of it this way: you can bully one kid in the back of the schoolyard, but if there's 44 of his friends lined up behind him, you're going to think twice. And so and that's the beauty of the BRICS as a growing economic power. There are 11 countries now, and there's another like 30 or 40 applicants waiting to join. That's that becomes a much larger piece of the global GDP, and certainly it's the part that's growing the fastest. And so the Trump administration is going to have to reckon with that reality and deal with it in a way that I think is going to have to come through negotiation as opposed to using a cudgel.
But just on that point, actually, since we've sort of deviated towards the BRICS, and then obviously our favorite Bitcoin bit, is BRICS being, numbers are something, but they're not everything. And if you can't leverage those numbers, then it's not necessarily going to be that useful. The bigger an organization gets, the more bloated it becomes, because the more voices have to be heard, and compromises or concessions have to be given. So I agree with you that BRICS is certainly more than something I would have thought about 5-10 years ago, but I'm still on the fence about to the extent that it can be leveraged. The reason the G7 works is because every country is a democracy. They have similar values and ideals, right? We can assume that, right, for conversation's sake. But BRICS is very diverse, and I do wonder how they're going to fully leverage that. Argentina's withdrawal, rejection is indicative of that, isn't it?
Yeah, but they've also gone back to court China. Both Argentina and Italy like during their campaign season to poo-poo all over China, and then once they were elected, they're now trying to. You can't quit China in a world like that. It's impossible. You can't. It's too big a piece of the world puzzle. So I think people say a lot of things, especially during campaigns, including Trump, that then they have to deal with governing in reality. And I do think, regardless of what you say about BRICS versus the G7 and democracy, I think democracy has very little to do with it. I think this is business. Is what's a more effective way to trade in this new global architecture? And will countries find a more convenient, less costly way and safer way from being, threatened with all sorts of sanctions? The U.S. has now about 60% of the world's poor countries under sanctions. And, and a lot of it, I have my own opinion about sanctions. They really don't work in the long run. They, especially the way they've been used in the past while. And countries are very resentful of these sanctions, that the U.S. can arbitrarily, try and destroy a country's economy, and just because they don't agree with whatever it is they're doing. I mean, look at Cuba. 60 years of sanctions. What's it achieved except to deprive the population of a decent meal and medicine? And so, has it changed anything? No. And Venezuela, did it get Maduro kicked out? No. What sanctions usually do is impoverish the population and embolden the regime to be able to point to the enemy and say, this is not our fault. It's those bad Americans that are doing this to you, and they stay in power. How many regimes have been overthrown by sanctions? It's very rare. And so I think that the world is starting to wake up to this fact, and then and it's a big world out there. The U.S. is like 4% of the world's population. There's a lot of people out there that would like to see a more fair economic landscape. So I think it's really about economics. It's about trade. It's whether it's a democracy or not a democracy, it doesn't seem to bother. Does it bother India buying oil from Russia? I mean,
no, for sure.
I think that's a lesser. The whole values thing is a lesser concern when it comes down to the practical issues.
No, for sure. If you're talking about getting down to brass tacks, there are no values, there are only interests. I think that's a pretty common quip in international relations.
Kissinger made that statement. The U.S. doesn't have allies or friends; it only has interests.
Yeah. No, I know. It's more the point I think about it's just a sort of counterbalance against the BRICS. And I agree with you on sanctions. I've been incredibly critical of them. I think people who support sanctions often allude to apartheid and its ability to have overcome the South African example then. But that was decades in the making, and also because the international system was largely against it anyway. But the other issue with sanctions is that because you have a very limited economic policy toolkit, right? You've got either full-scale hard power invasion, military action, soft power diplomacy, cultural exchange, etc. And then in the middle, sort of economics, but use of coercive diplomacy through, sanctioning you. So it is a tough one. And I do think that the US is over-reliant on them in a way because it's just got a bit lazy. But it's become a business, okay? Those folks that advise on sanctions, the think tanks, and all, this is a very corrupt business, sanctions world, and you should look at it very closely. And it is supported by certain regimes that lobby very heavily in D.C. to get sanctions on other regimes. It's a very corrupt game. No, for sure. But I guess what that means for me then is a curiosity about where Trump, sort of an evolution of Western foreign policy. I am increasingly of the mind that perhaps transactionality, less of a values-based approach, might be necessary, because at the end of the day, you end up not doing business when it might be better just to accept that you can't persuade a certain country to adopt human rights or certain policies that you'd like to hope for. But you ultimately lose out, right? Relative versus absolute gains in international relations.
But Peter, I think that most of the world has seen through the hypocrisy of this rules-based international order, and the idea that one should never support an authoritarian regime. The U.S. supports lots of them and has throughout history. It just depends on what its interests are in that particular region. So this whole concept of democracy versus a different type of governance, the world is not buying it anymore.
No, but that's my point. I'm agreeing with you. Okay, I agree. No, I agree with you, because I think that's my point. Should the West not be more transparent? And we had an arbitrary example in the news at the time of recording yesterday, was that the UK has been treating asylum seekers in the Chagos Islands, where Diego Garcia is a huge, important security base, have been breaching, basic human rights violations of the Geneva Convention. So the UK, which is one that promotes all this sort of rhetoric, but then it does it itself. So should we not just drop the act and engage in transactionality?
I've been saying that for a long time, but it's hard to drop an act when you've been reading off the same playbook since the end of World War II. We are the shining light on the hill, and we have free speech and all these beautiful ideas, and then run around the world like a wrecking ball, invading Iraq, Afghanistan, and bombing Libya, and that it's not just the U.S. It's the U.S. and the U.K. and France is involved, and and the world is getting tired of this. Nobody believes it anymore, especially after the Israel-Gaza situation. I mean, on one hand, Putin's an international criminal and he should, be tried by the International Criminal Court. But when it comes to Israel, it's committing something that looks very much like a genocide there, and the UK and the US, so have a different. So the world's seen through that, and they're tired of it. They're tired of it. It's hypocrisy at the highest level.
So how do you see us moving forward in this regard, and also from an economic standpoint? If we've got someone who's much more wanting to just deal with whoever because it means he can get something from it. Is this an opportunity for the West to reset? And what does that do for the global macro outlook?
Yeah, it is an opportunity. Do I believe it will happen? No, and I think there's going to be fragmentation between U.S. and, say, Europe. I mean, I don't think they're going to be as under Trump. I think Trump has a much different agenda than previous administrations with respect to its relationships with Europe and other countries that were once considered allies. He's going to be very transactional, and he's going to try and deal with each situation on its own. Can the West reset? I don't see it right now. I really don't see it, especially under Trump. I think maybe Trump, I think the one great thing is that he might try and end the war in Ukraine. I think he'll find it much more difficult than he believes, but at least he'll try. And I think that's a good thing, because I think otherwise it's just going to be one of these things that just goes on and on and on forever, and nobody wins. And all that happens is that people die. But I think with respect to the Trump administration wanting to maintain hegemony is the word, sorry, and global supremacy, and it's America first with respect to trade and everything else, and that I think that approach is going to run into problems. We'll see what happens in the next 4 years, but my guess is that America will not take the let's find a different way. Let's have a more equal world, fair world. I think it's going to be America first in all regards, and I think that's Trump's style, and he hopes it's going to work, and my guess is that it won't.
So, what does that do for the US-China strategic competition? Because that is such an overarching thing for the global economy. To bring in a bit more of the global macro of it. Obviously, those two don't decouple, but the Biden administration have been trying to target specific industries. China does have its own economic challenges. I'm not saying it's collapsing. Don't worry, people. I know that's a ridiculous notion. But, China has its own challenges. So if things get really bad between these two, even more of a heightened trade war than we saw in term one of Trump, what does that do to the markets and financial flows?
Well, I think we're going to see very shortly, because, China has its own way to fight back, and they're already shooting. They took a few shots across the bow recently with respect to the banning of certain rare earths and minerals, because they control the processing and refining of most of the most important minerals that the world needs, not only for transition to green energy, but also for military. They control it. They control 80 to 90% of most of this stuff. And they are just announced bans on the exports of some of the very more important material that are needed for the advanced chips. And certainly things like cobalt and nickel and copper. And, like I said, they spent the last 20 years, investing around the world to get access to these minerals. And I think that, if Trump starts to impose tariffs, it'll be a tit for tat. Then there'll be a currency war. China will weaken its currency and be accused of currency manipulation in order to make up for the loss of exports because of the tariffs. And these things tend to escalate. And at some point, someone has to go, okay, what's the next step? Is it going to be a hot war? Because that's usually what happens, or not. I think we're living at a time in history where a hot wars between global powers is a really dumb idea, really dumb, and it could be the end of our species. But so I don't know. I just think that, as with all entrenched powers, it's hard to give up power. And usually they don't do it peacefully, and that is the problem with our species, is that we do this over and over again throughout the centuries. So I think that the U.S. is going to be very reluctant to give up anything until it absolutely is forced, and that may take all sorts of different types of conflicts.
Well, and in times of such global uncertainty, economic uncertainty, therefore, you then need to be taking, effective steps to secure yourself, protect yourself. You're a big supporter of more, shall we say, traditional forms, gold and other things like that. But Bitcoin has now surpassed 100,000 So, and it's now, still going up at 107, I think, as of today I saw. But, then 1 minute it's at 103. But what does that tell you about the state of people's preferences of the way that we invest, or the way that we look at trying to secure and protect against such instability?
I think you have to separate what's happening in North America with what's happening in the rest of the world. And the best way to put this into context is to say this. If you look at what's happening with sophisticated buyers, being both the central banks, every central bank outside of the G7 has been buying gold for the last 15 years, and now at an accelerating pace. And a couple of them, being China and Saudi Arabia, are doing it quite secretly. Okay, they're not disclosing the amount of gold they truly own, and we can guess this through various reports of tracking gold flows from refineries to countries around the world. I can assure you that Saudi Arabia and China are buying a lot of gold very secretly. Russia is outwardly talking about its gold holdings, as are many other countries, like Poland, coming out and say that they want to increase their gold reserves over the next few years. And what are they doing? They're selling U.S. dollar treasuries and buying gold. And now gold is the number 2 held asset in central banks, just top the euro, as behind the dollar, obviously, which has a dominant position at this moment in time. And then you look at, so they're doing this consistently, at an accelerating pace, and sometimes quite secretly. Whereas on the other hand, you have the American media, the Wall Street, and a lot of these pundits screaming at the top of their lungs for the retail community to buy Bitcoin. Okay, that tells me everything I need to know as a sophisticated investor, what's really happening in the world. And in this conversation about a Bitcoin reserve in the U.S. is ludicrous. And I can sit here all day long and punch holes as to why that will not work. And it's being promoted by a community that invested very heavily in this last election. They put over $200 million, the crypto community, into getting certain Congress people elected, including Trump. Trump became a crypto promoter because it helped him win the election. A very smart move on his part, I have to say. But and now the crypto crowd is going, well, you got to create a reserve status, just buy Bitcoin, sell your gold, sell your gold and buy Bitcoin as a Bitcoin reserve. And again, if you've got the time, I can walk you through why this is a really dumb idea that will never work practically.
Please.
They want to. No, but seriously, you announce that you're going to create a Bitcoin reserve, and you are going to buy, say, whatever it is, 1 million Bitcoin over the next few years. What's the market going to do? It's going to front run you, okay? And they're going to be paying a lot higher for your Bitcoin. And then what are you going to do with it? Who are you going to sell it to? If the rest of the world is buying gold, what's your Bitcoin going to do for you? These ideas that, Bitcoin will go to 1 million a coin and they can use that to pay off the federal debt. These are ludicrous, naive, and reckless ideas, but this is part of why Bitcoin is being promoted by the likes of Michael Saylor, who I debated, 4 years ago on the gold versus Bitcoin debate 4 years ago. He's a shameless promoter, and and he's announced that he's already borrowed $21 billion to buy Bitcoin for his MicroStrategy company. He's announced that he's going to spend another $42 billion over the next 3 years in issuing shares and debt. He's trying to create a perpetual motion machine here, and it's to me it's a Ponzi game. It's a Ponzi game that eventually has to collapse. And besides, Bitcoin is almost 100% correlated with the U.S. stock market, especially the Nasdaq, the tech stocks, and they're trading at all-time historical highs, beyond bubble. And it has to correct at some point. All bubbles burst, and when that bubble bursts, it'll take Bitcoin with it. Gold has an inverse relationship with markets, with the U.S. dollar. It is your hedge against human stupidity. And so I think that this whole hype about Bitcoin, it's, right now, and listen, people are making money. Someone's getting rich, and that's great. But the idea of positioning it as a potential reserve currency, just look at what the rest of the world is doing. This is a conversation in America.
So Frank, but okay, so the last question, I guess, aside from, anything you think people should look out for in 2025 is though that, so we've got the wild card of Bitcoin, but we've got the, should we say, strains and stresses on the US dollar in terms of countries' perception of it. Are we reverting to some kind of golden period into war period sort of thing, or what?
Yeah, I think gold will, again, I can't predict, I can give you a number of different scenarios. I can't predict how gold will be used in any reset of the global monetary system, which I think is coming at some point. We'll have a reset, and it's going to either happen peacefully or not, but there's going to be a reset, and gold will play a role. Now, I think gold-backed currencies, maybe, less likely. But gold as a means of settling cross-border trade using central bank digital currencies, as with the M-Bridge project, which your viewers should look up. M as a mother, Bridge, which was a pilot project set up by China, Thailand, UAE, Hong Kong, and now Saudi Arabia has just joined it. And it was done in partnership with the Bank of International Settlements until they just backed out recently. And I can tell you it was probably under U.S. pressure that they backed out. But it's basically a cross-border settlement system using local currencies, defined as central bank digital currencies, to settle trades between countries. And if you think, all those same M-Bridge countries have been buying a lot of gold. I mean, they're just, especially China, Saudi Arabia. And the idea, a very simple mechanism, is that you have bilateral trade between two countries using this mechanism. And at the end of a period, if there is a deficit and some unwanted currency that can't be used in that bilateral trade, you settle that deficit with gold on whether it's semi-annually, annually, whatever. So that's so easy to do, and would provide a validation of these currencies and allow countries to trade in local currencies and not get stuck with unwanted foreign currency.
Well, bonus question then, but so it goes back to your point about fragmentation. Are we sort of seeing a regionalization again of trade, right? This is a rejection of globalization, or deglobalization is in full swing. And so we're seeing an uptake of this bilateral exchange and sort of done through one country specific currency, whichever is more powerful or whatever it is. And so that begins to, but we still need a kind of global reserve currency, do we not? Or it will sort of become very much a byproduct, and where does this take us? I guess.
Yeah, I think eventually, you got to differentiate between a reserve currency, the purpose of a currency as a reserve currency, and one for trading purposes. They're two different things that are usually thought as one. But I think as the U.S. dollar is going to be a smaller and smaller portion of central bank reserves, because they're all selling their treasuries and replacing it with gold. That's going to happen over a period of time. That's not going to happen overnight. But what will happen, and what is already happening, is the bilateral trade in local currencies. And as that becomes more efficient with technology, with these things like the M-Bridge and other mechanisms, I think that's going to reduce the need for U.S. dollars in the international system. And as you reduce the need for a currency, it reduces its value. So that's the part that people should focus on, and stop thinking about just what percentage of central bank reserves are in U.S. dollars. That's already going down but it'll go down slowly. It can't happen overnight. I think it's at around 59% now.
60%, yeah.
Down from 72%. But that even China can't dump its entire. It's doing its best. By the way, it's come down from 1.1 trillion of U.S. Treasuries down to 730 billion, and it sold 50 billion in the last quarter. But you can't do it overnight. This takes time, and they're buying gold instead. So you got to see what's happening here.
No, it's at 60%. It's been at around 57%, but then it went up again after Ukraine. But I mean, the renminbi's been at 2.5, 2.8%. It's never gone above 3. The euro's at about 20. So no, it's really interesting. It's a good distinction that I've always pondered, and you've articulated what I've been trying to frame in my head. So thank you for that, Frank, and thank you very much for this extensive conversation. It's been a real pleasure to have you back. And well, let's see if some of what you've said and laid out for us plays into 2025, either in a sort of radical, sudden sense or a bit more gradual, slow burning sense. But
sorry, I screwed up the word hegemony. Okay,
hey,
don't normally do that. But anyway, thank you, Peter. It was very much of a pleasure talking to you, and we'll do this again sometime.
Yeah, and to all of you watching, everyone, we would like to wish you peace of mind. And as we say on the Global Gambit, you've either got to get playing or be played. Take care, everyone.